Well, this tutorial is going to be fun. It's mainly showing you how to blend your colors while your paint is wet, but also to show the shine with your highlights. You're going to be using a big flat, 2-inch flat. You'll be using your larger round, an 8 or a 10. You'll be using your number 4 round and your number 2 round. And you're also going to use your very fine liner. Sorry, you can't see this too well. My camera must have moved off shot. You'll also be using some salt. The colors, cadmium yellow. You can either use yellow ochre or you can use some gamboge yellow. You're going to be using cadmium red. You'll be using alizarin crimson. You're also going to be using burnt umber as well as burnt sienna. Little bits of purple. Little bits of, little bits of turquoise. We'll also be using indigo as well as your black. Now, you don't have to use all of these colors, especially like the turquoise and the purple, but I kind of wanted to add a little bit of color that we wouldn't be normally using. Also some cerulean blue. You can see that I drew my peaches because we're going to be painting the peach slices individually, so you want to make sure you have those sketched in. You do not have to get real detailed with the lids. I'm going to do one complete jar of peaches for you because there's really no sense of wasting the video time doing all the jars because they are all done exactly the same. So I'm going to do one from start until finish so that you can see exactly how they're done. We'll start off with our cadmium yellow, but you want to have your other colors wet and ready. Your yellow ochre or your gamboge, your reds, your alizarin crimsons, your umbers, and your blacks, because they are going to get put in initially when your peach pieces are nice and wet. Of course, we're going to be doing each peach piece separately. You don't want to go beside each other, so you can skip over one slice to go to the next so that you can get your colors in. And follow your picture colors. I added a little bit of my red to this yellow to get a little bit more of a peachy tone. I don't want it to be pink. I don't want it to be red. I just want it to be a little bit more peachy toned so that when I do add in my reds and my crimson colors, I'll still have that nice vibrant yellow. It's important that you leave a nice vibrant yellow on your peach slices. Don't totally cover them up unless it's one of the lower sections that it's deeper into the juices. Now I added in some of my burnt sienna color. I mixed it with a tiny little bit of red so that it would have a little bit more of a red tone. I'm doing it while my peach pieces are nice and wet because I want them to have a soft blend of color. I'm using my umber up here, and if you look at your picture, you'll be able to see what colors you want to put in. Do you want to put in reds? Do you want to put in peaches? You want to do lightest to darkest. So if it looks like there's alizarin crimson and burnt umber, you want to do your crimsons first before you do your darker colors. Put them in while everything is nice and wet. If they're starting to dry, then let them totally dry and you can re-wet them. But you want to make sure they are totally dry before you re-wet, or you'll lift color and get a wash back, and it'll not make you happy. You want to make sure that you dry your sections in between before you start to paint next to them, but you're going to be doing all of the sections basically the same. Your yellows or your peaches first, and then adding in your color. This is just going to be like a first base. You're going to be doing more as we go with coloring. Nice yellow. Remember, if it's too washed out, it's going to dry lighter. So if you're putting it on and you can barely see it, it's going to dry that you will see it even less. So you want to use some nice intense color. That doesn't mean you have to glob it on thick. It just means you want to have a nice intense yellow so that it really shows through once we put our other washes on. Putting in my Cad Red or alizarin crimson, and you can kind of switch it. You can use alizarin crimson on some of the slices and Cad Yellow on some, because not every peach is exactly the same. So you can kind of switch up your colors. You want to make sure too that you get them on nice and vibrant, because they are also going to dry lighter. So if you can barely see it when you're putting it on wet, it's going to dry lighter. Blend it with your brush if you need to, but if you are wet, it will soften itself in the wetness of the other colors. Get as dark as you feel you'll need, because remember, we're going to be toning this down with washes later. This is just your first wash. This is just the coloring of your peaches, your sections of your peaches. I'm using my fine liner, my fine rigger, to add in that little bit of black shadow while it's wet. I'm going to be going back in later and adding more, but this is just the initial part. So if this doesn't get too dark, it's perfectly fine, because we can always darken that later. Again, remember to dry your sections before you paint next to them. You want to go dry against wet. And even the little sections of peaches are going to have color to them. The last section in my jar that's visible, again, I'm using my Cadmium Yellow. Then I will be putting in my reds or my alizarin crimsons. And lastly, I'll be putting in my little bits of black. Now, you might want to know why I'm using black versus indigo, for the simple reason that because my yellow is wet, if I try to mix in my indigo, blue and yellow make green. So there's a very good possibility that by blending in my indigo, I'll be getting green, and I do not want green in on my peaches as my shadowing. So I'm using my watered down black instead. Once my painting is dry, then I can go in and put in a little bit of indigo, because then it's not a wash, it's a layer. So there's a big difference between washing it in, but that's when it's wet, going on wet, or when you're doing, a layer of color, of transparent color, then it's just a little bit different. So I'm just using my black little bits. Don't overdo. You can always go back in and add, especially with watercolor. Less is always better. And then when I get to the very bottom of my jar, that's all juice. So I'm painting that in with a more intense peachy color because that's going to be done in heavy shadow later. And I want that peachy, orangey, yellow color to come through a little bit. So I'm using a more intense peach color for the juice in the bottom of my jar. Just a straight paint color. Nothing blended in, nothing added. For right now, it's just the straight color. Now I'm going to be adding in some additional shadowing to my peach sections, but I don't want to do it wet on dry, only because I don't want to try to soften the edges and lift any color. So when I put my coloring in, I'm going to wet my surface first with some additional yellow. Doesn't have to be real dark. You can darken it in sections, but you want to put on, instead of using just plain water, I'm putting on a wash of Cad Yellow. And then that way when I add in my additional shadowing, it's going to be done wet on wet. It'll have a nice soft blend, and it'll soften itself because it's on a wet surface. So I'm putting on just a wash of pale yellow. You can put on a wash of pale peach if you'd rather have it more peachy looking. That's strictly up to you. But this way, when you are adding your shadows, which is your black, it will soften itself in the wet paint. Follow your picture. You can see where there are little sections of the shadows, and that's because they are layered on top of each other. So you want to put in your color, again, a little bit at a time, because that way you won't, overdo. You can always add, but it's certainly much more difficult to take off. Continue wetting your area or areas, and adding in your shadowing. As long as it's wet, then you'll be okay. Now, if for some reason you think that your coloring is already really intense and you don't want to add additional coloring to drop in your shadows, then you can go ahead and go with just plain water. But I was just using some coloring just to make sure that my nice intense yellows and that came through. Now when you get to the base where the juice is, that's going to be in total shadow. So a nice watered down black, and you're going to cover the entire base of that. And the reason is because it is at the base. There's really no light getting in there because all of the peach pieces are, up against the glass, and so there's no additional light showing into the base of that jar. So a nice wash. When that is dry, that peach color will show through a little bit, but you don't want it to be real peachy because you do want it to resemble a shadowed area. So you're putting in your watered down black. You can add some additional blacks in the bottom just so it's not all one tone, but don't overdo. You don't want to over extend your black coloring. I'm doing a little bit of shadowing down the right side of the jar, just with some real watered down black, because that's going to help make the jar look like it's rounded. I'm making sure that I soften that edge slightly. And again, before you do this, you want to make sure everything else is really dry so that you don't create any kind of a washback. Everything on your jar should be nice and dry, really dry. Doing the same thing on the left side, going down the left-hand side of my jar, just a nice thin line of my watered down black. Again, this is just making the jar look rounded because the center of the jar will not have as much shadowing as the edges of the jar. There will be some, but not as much. I made a few really pale lines down the center of the jar, skipping some areas almost like a striping, but they are really, really pale. A wash of cerulean blue, very pale, for the lid initially. That's going to be the base color. So it's going to be nice and pale, cerulean blue. And while it's wet, I'm going to be dragging through some watered down black in some of the darker areas of the lid. So if you look at your picture and you see where some of the darker areas of the lid are, that's where you're going to drag through some very watered down black. It's not going to be really dark yet. It's just going to give it a little bit of an extra wash of darker color. More to show the shape of the lid, but also so you don't have to do as much painting in later. Nice and wet, just let it dissipate in the cerulean blue, going along the edge, helping to show the shape of the lid. And you'll notice that it didn't really go too far. It didn't run everywhere. And that's because my cerulean blue, although it was wet, it wasn't puddle wet. Now everything is nice and dry, and I'm going to start to put in my darker colors. I'm following the picture. Darker colors along the edges, softening with water as I get towards the center. Some straight stripe lines, some thicker than others. But now we're going to start to shape and form the lid just using blacks different values of black. At this point, if you want to stop, run the video a little bit farther ahead, you'll see exactly what I'm going to be doing, and then return it back to this point and you can paint along with it. But you'll have a better idea of what I'm painting and how I'm painting it. Now this is really enough on the lid for now. We're going to be going back in and highlighting in a couple minutes, but I want to add in a little bit of black along the top of the jar where that little rim of glass is. I'm wetting it first just with water, and then I will do a line with my rigger, a thin brush, along the bottom of where I wet, and allow that just to soften itself in the water. This is just to show that little ridge of glass that's at the very top of the jar. Now with my rigger, my real fine liner, I'm going to be putting in the really fine black lines. The fine black lines both on the jar and up in the lid, but I want to go ahead and put those in with my fine liner. You will see exactly where they need to go just by looking at your picture. After I get in my fine black lines, then I'll be putting in some other details in the lid. You have all of those little indentations in your lid, so follow your picture. The more detail that you get on your lid, the more realistic it's going to look. I'm not using my real fine one for all of my lines, but for my little indentation lines, I'm using a number 2. Again, everything is done with different values of black. I'm not changing up my color. If you want to add a little bit of indigo to this, you can, but all of my lid work is done with different values of black. Nice little straight lines. It's very important that you make sure these are straight up and down. They don't have to all be exactly the same, but they do have to be straight. And they are done in different values. The ones on the right-hand side are much darker than those in the center. And then it gets back to being a little bit darker, only because the ones in the center have the most light hitting up against them. Now after I get most of my fine lines put in, there's still going to be sections that I can add, but those can be added anytime, and especially they'll be more visible to see where you might need something once you get your background put in. But this is just to get your jar done about 95%. Once you get all of your lines in that you can see now, we're going to go in and use that very fine brush again, and we're going to write the word ball for the type of jar that it is. You can see that on your picture. It's done in very, very, very watered down black because you don't want to be able to really read it. You want to see that there is the impression of that word in the jar, but you don't want it to be done so dark that that is what your eye is drawn to. So real watered down, just the word ball. We will highlight some of those letters also once we get into our white. But you can see how this has gone so far. This looks like a perfect jar of peaches. So realistic looking. Now we're going to add in our white highlights. Normally we would do this at the very end, but because I'm showing you this total jar from start to finish, I'm going to put some of them in now. I will go back at the very end of the painting and add anything that I think needs added, but I'm following my picture, and where I see that white in my jar from where the light is hitting, I'm putting in some nice intense lines of my white. Just follow your picture for these highlights. It'll be much easier to see also when you have your darker background in and all of your other jars are in place. But again, this will just show you simply where I put them in from your jar start to finish, because all of your jars are going to be done exactly the same way. That doesn't mean that the peach pieces will be in the exact same positions, but they're all going to be done the same. All of the jars are going to be done the same. The peach sections, the glass, any writing on the glass, and the lids. Not all lids are exactly the same, but they are very, very similar. So the way that you've done this one jar is going to be the way you are going to do your other jars. Now, when you do your other jars, you may choose to not be doing one from start to finish. You may want to do all of your peach pieces first, and then all of your lids. It doesn't matter how you do them, and it really wouldn't have mattered how we did this one, but just to save time on the length of the video, I did one whole jar from start to finish for you. Okay, so this is what your completed jar will look like. And once you get them all done, look how cool this looks. They look like they're just lined up on the shelf, ready to eat. You can see that all of the jars are done basically exactly the same. The shapes of the peach pieces are a little different, but they are all done the same. And almost all of every peach piece is still has that nice bright yellow. You don't want to lose your bright yellows. So make sure when you are adding in your reds or you're adding in your shadows, you don't cover up too much of all of the peaches. You want to keep those nice yellows. Now we're going to work on the towel that it sits on, or if you want to just have it as a table. But I'm going to wet my whole towel just with clean water. Make sure too, because you're working with brighter colors in this, you want to make sure you always have nice clean water. So I am putting in my nice wet towel, and I'm just going to do a little bit at a time on this because it's the whole section of the bottom. I don't want to get too crazy. I'm After I wet my towel, I'm dragging through some watered down black just in the areas. If you look at your towel, you'll see where there might be some little wrinkles or bumps in the towel. That's what I'm using as the areas for my watered down black stripes. That way, when I go to finish them off or to give them a little bit more detail, my initial coloring is already going to be there. So I have those nice watered down black stripes, nothing too extremely dark, and I am salting those. I want some texture in this towel because this is a woven towel, so I want to get that nice texturing put in there. After I get this initial towel color in, then I'm going to be going up to the background. I'm going to wet my whole background. I don't want anything very detailed back there because my jars are about as detailed as you could get. So I don't want a lot of detail in the background because then they're going to fight each other. So I'm just wetting my whole background, and I'm going to add in vertical stripes of color. Gray, my watered down black, my cerulean blue, my purple. You can put in a little bit of indigo at this time if you want to. But if you look at the background, you know there's a doorway back there, there's some pipes back there. I don't want that. But to give the impression of things going on back there, I'm just putting in lines of color, vertical lines, sections of color. Both my indigo, both my, you can use umber mixed with black, straight black, cerulean. The cerulean on the right I made to look like there's some pipes back there. I'm putting in that purple color. I love that purple color. That purple color can be used for your shadowing too in the bottom of your jars. That purple color is alizarin crimson, purple, and black. And I am just putting in some nice muted color. It's really wet back there, so all of the things that I put in are going to be able to soften themselves in the wetness of the background. I threw a tiny little bit of salt on back there, but I did not salt the whole background, just a little bit. And I wanted to do everything while it was still nice and wet, because once it starts to dry, then you have a more difficult time of keeping it from looking too detailed. So everything was, while it was nice and wet, you can still see how nice and wet it is. But it was nice and wet, so when I threw on those vertical lines of color, it just all blended nicely together. You don't have to use these colors. If you want to stay with indigo and cerulean, you could do that and then drag through some black or darker indigo, but the coloring is up to you. I wanted to stay with the coloring that I had already used, but I didn't want to compete with my yellows and my peaches. So I wanted to keep my background with some of the darker colors. I used some water splashing, just a wet brush, and splashed in while it was wet, and that's what gave you those polka dot looks. Nothing very detailed at all. Shadowing is going to go in behind those jars, so don't spend a lot of time behind the jars because that's going to be mainly shadowed. I dried everything really well. I took the salt off of my towel, and now using that little bit of turquoise, I'm putting in the design on the towel. There's one little stripe design on that towel. I'm putting that in there. If you don't want any kind of a design in your towel, you certainly don't have to. Along the edges where there's rounded seams to the towel, I'm dry brushing in an arched fashion to show the roundness of the hem in the towel. Again, it's up to you what you want to do if you want to get this detailed, but I like to show a lot of detail since my jars are real detailed. I'll be dry brushing also across the front of my towel, just a little bit, not a whole lot, because I don't want to get too crazy with detail in my towel, because again, that is going to take away from all of the detail in my jars. Little bit of dry brushing, not a lot. Some of my dry brushing I'm having go uphill to show the position of the towel. It doesn't have to just be straight across. Putting in a fine, fine line for a little bit of a shadow in the hem of the towel in the front. The white piece in that lower right corner is actually a paper towel. That's different than the towel. And you'll see when I start to paint in all of these shadowed areas from the towel that the piece in the front is different. Following my picture, I'm just shadowing the crinkles in this paper towel. And I'm following my picture where it's darkest, and then I'm using my wet brush to soften the edges. Dry your areas before you continue so that you don't have one shadow bleeding into another that you don't want. Now I'm starting to go behind my jars and put in the shadowing that I see behind my jars. You're going to have different values of shadow. There's going to be really dark black shadows. There's going to be lighter washed out shadows. So you're going to have different values. and I'm just following what I see in my picture. I'm going to be doing that throughout all of my jars. When you put in these shadows, what a difference it makes. It makes the picture absolutely come alive. You absolutely, totally, 100% need shadows and highlights to make something look real. Otherwise, it just looks flat. The shadows give it form and give it shape. The different values of shadow show how near something is to the towel or how far away it is. You need the different values of shadows. Not all shadows are hard, not all shadows are soft. But the picture that is sent to you will show you exactly how your shadowing should be. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to wonder how it should look, if it's soft or hard. It should tell you just by looking at your picture. Other than the peaches, one of the favorite parts of my picture is the shadow under this fold in the towel. Nice and dark black, and then I'm just going to soften the edge with some water. But this shows you exactly how that towel is lifted up just by putting in that little shadow. It's just amazing what just a couple lines will do for a picture. Softening it with water, and look how that is. I mean, how amazing is that? That just lifted that towel right up for you just by putting in that little bit of a black line. Finishing off my shadows, just following my picture. Nothing too intense, nothing too crazy, just a little bit of detail in that towel. Soften with water where it needs softened. Now I'll add in my really dark hard shadows right at the base of my jars, right where it's sitting on the towel. Those are your nice hard lines. You can look at your picture first if you want to, just to see exactly where they'll be, but you have nice thin hard lines. Make sure all of your salt and everything is removed so that you don't try to do a nice smooth line and hit some salt granules. Make sure all of your salt is off. Make sure everything is nice and dry, and then you can add in your nice hard lines. This is just black. Again, you can add a little bit of indigo or a little bit of purple to your black if you want to change up your color a little bit. But for these nice hard shadows, I just simply used my black. I'm going to go ahead in and do some additional highlighting now that everything is finished. I'm going to use my white again, and if I need to add in any little dots here and there, now that my picture is finished, it's easier for me to see where I might need something or where I might have left something out. Go jar by jar, look at your picture, look at your painting, and you will see exactly where you need to add a little bit of white. Mainly just some little dots here and there, a couple little lines, or if my white highlight has dried and it is not as visible as I would like it to be, put another layer on of some nice bright white, and this makes such a difference in your picture also. For as much as you need your shadows, that's how much you need your highlights. Just love this picture. A watercolor original by me, Marcy. Any additional questions or comments, just email me at watercolorstudio1021@gmail.com. Happy painting!